Imagine a beach at dawn. Not the beach you know from photographs, the gray water and the steel obstacles and the landing craft grinding onto sand. Something earlier than that. The hour before the main assault. A single figure standing at the prow of a landing craft, silhouetted against the lightning sky, playing the bagpipes. Around him, shells are falling. The men crouching in the craft behind him are doing what men do when shells are falling. Making themselves small, trying to disappear inside their helmets. And at the front of the boat, in full view, a British officer is playing a Scottish lament into the smoke and the noise and the approaching shore. His name was Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. His men called him Mad Jack. The Germans, who encountered him on multiple occasions and found each encounter more confusing than the last, had no name for him. They had simply never seen anything like him. He was carrying a Scottish broadsword that morning. He had been carrying it since 1940. He had also, at various points during the war, carried a longbow, a quiver of arrows, and the bagpipes currently announcing his arrival to the coast of occupied territory. This is not a story about madness. It is a story about a man who had decided, quietly and completely, that the only way to fight a war was to be entirely, relentlessly himself, and who turned out to be exactly what the moment required. John Churchill was born in 1906 into a British military family and educated at the Royal Military College, Sandhurst. He was, by temperament and training, a soldier. But between the wars, the British Army offered limited scope for men of his particular disposition, and he filled the gap in ways that tell you a great deal about what he was. He learned to play the bagpipes. Not casually, not as a curiosity, but seriously. He became good enough to compete at the British Open Pipe Band Championship. He took up the longbow at a time when the longbow had been obsolete for roughly 4 centuries. He practiced until he was competent at distances that would have been respectable in the 14th century. He also worked as a film extra, appeared in a crowd scene in a picture called The Thief of Baghdad, and spent a period living in East Africa where he rode a motorcycle and worked as a newspaper dispatch writer. He was not an eccentric in the drawing room sense, not a collector of odd things or an exhibitionist at dinner parties. He was an eccentric in the deeper, harder sense. A man whose understanding of what mattered was simply different from the standard model, and who had no particular interest in adjusting it to match. When the war began in September 1939, he was 33 years old and living in a world that had suddenly become exactly the kind of place he was equipped for. Churchill was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, Manchester Regiment, and deployed to France in 1939 as part of the British Expeditionary Force. He brought his longbow and his broadsword. His commanding officers apparently decided that these were his business and not theirs. In May 1940, during the fighting retreat to Dunkirk, Churchill's unit was engaged near the town of Lepanette. In the confusion of the fighting, Churchill spotted a German NCO, a non-commissioned officer, moving through a field at a range of approximately 180 yards. He drew his bow. He loosed an arrow. The German fell. It is, according to historians who have verified it, the only confirmed longbow kill in the Second World War. Possibly the only confirmed longbow kill in any war since the 16th century. Churchill noted it in his diary with characteristic understatement. It had been a reasonable shot, he felt. The range was not exceptional. He escaped from Dunkirk with the rest of the BEF and was returned to Britain. He was decorated, promoted, and assigned to the newly formed No. 3 Commando, one of the elite raiding units that Churchill had personally championed in the dark months of 1940 when offense against German-held Europe seemed like a distant fantasy. The Commandos suited him. They were built around small unit operations, speed, surprise, and the willingness to operate under conditions that conventional forces could not. They needed men who were comfortable with ambiguity, with darkness, with the knowledge that help was probably not coming. Churchill was all of these things. In December 1941, Churchill led a raid on the Norwegian island of Vagsø, one of the first major commando raids of the war. The objective was to destroy German fish oil processing facilities, which were producing glycerin for explosives, and to disrupt the German garrison. Churchill prepared for the assault in the way that seemed natural to him. As the landing craft came in toward the shore, he stood at the bow with his broadsword buckled at his hip and his bagpipes in his hands, playing March of the Cameron Men, a traditional Scottish tune that carries both the melancholy of departure and the wildness of what comes after. He leaped off the craft first, threw a grenade into the doorway of the nearest building, and charged through the smoke with his sword drawn. The action at Vägsö lasted the better part of a day. The German garrison was dug in throughout the town and in the fish oil factories along the waterfront, and clearing them required block by block fighting in narrow streets against an enemy who knew the ground and had the high ground on the hillside above. Churchill led his troop through it with the sword in one hand and whatever else was required in the other, moving through doorways and alleys with the kind of forward momentum that is either training or temperament or some combination that becomes indistinguishable. The action at Vägsö was fierce and costly. The commandos achieved their objectives. Churchill led his section through alley-to-alley fighting with a combination of tactical competence and personal aggression that his men found simultaneously inspiring and deeply strange. He later described it as one of the most satisfying days of his life. He was awarded the Military Cross for Vägsö. He was also, by now, becoming something of a legend within the commandos, a figure who existed at the intersection of genuine effectiveness and something that functioned almost as theater. He understood, intuitively, something that military historians have spent decades trying to articulate, that in the moment of contact with the enemy, what matters is not just firepower but will. And will can be projected, can be performed. A man charging with a broadsword while playing bagpipes is sending a message to both his own men and to the enemy. And that message is, we are not afraid of you. Whether the Germans were confused or frightened or simply baffled is less important than the effect it had on the men following him. They followed. In 1943, Churchill was given command of 2 Commando and deployed to Yugoslavia, where he operated in support of Tito's partisan resistance movement. He conducted raids on German-held islands in the Adriatic with the same combination of meticulous preparation and personal daring that had characterized everything he did. He captured the German garrison of the island of Brac largely through the sustained aggressive pressure of a broadsword charge uphill toward a fortified position, an action that sounds impossible and apparently worked because no one, including the defending Germans, could quite believe it was happening. During this period in the Adriatic, Churchill also had what might have been his most improbably intimate encounter with the enemy. He captured a German soldier, alone at night using the broadsword, by approaching him silently from behind, touching the blade to his throat, and instructing him quietly in the few words of German Churchill possessed to be still. The soldier was still. Churchill marched him back to the partisan lines. He seemed pleased by the efficiency of the method. He saw no reason why a medieval weapon could not be operationally useful in a modern war. He had, after all, already proved it could be. In May 1944, during the partisan offensive, Churchill was caught in an ambush. His unit was surrounded by a German force and, after a series of firefights in which he continued to be aggressively, conspicuously armed, he was captured while playing the bagpipes. He was interrogated. He gave nothing useful. He was transferred to various prisoner-of-war camps, ending up at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a facility not designed for ordinary prisoners of war, a sign that the Germans regarded him with a particular wariness they probably couldn't have explained if pressed. In September 1944, Churchill escaped from Sachsenhausen. He had studied the camp's routines and the guard rotation until he saw the window he needed. With a fellow officer, he went through it and out into the German countryside. They walked 150 miles south and east, moving at night through a country that was at war with everything they were, surviving on whatever they could find in fields and orchards, making for the Allied front. They walked for weeks. They were recaptured near the Austrian border, cold and exhausted and, by all accounts, not particularly demoralized. He was transferred again, this time to a camp in the Tyrol, where he and a group of other high-value prisoners, political figures, military officers, family members of those who had plotted against Hitler, were being held under SS guard. In April 1945, as the Allied advance into Germany accelerated, the SS guards fled. Churchill led the prisoners out of the camp on foot and found the nearest American unit. He was disappointed to learn that Germany had surrendered before he could get back into the war. He was not entirely joking. He reportedly said that the Americans had ruined what would have been a perfectly good war by dropping atomic bombs on Japan and ending that conflict too. He had hoped to be transferred to the Pacific Theater. After the war, he taught land-air warfare at the Australian Staff College, took up surfing in Sydney, and became one of the first people in Britain to ride a surfboard, a handmade board he had constructed himself, which he took to the tidal bores of the river Severn. He died in 1996, at 89. To the end, he remained precisely who he had always been. It is easy to look at Jack Churchill and see the comedy first. The longbow, the sword, the bagpipes, the series of encounters with German forces that reads like a fever dream of military improbability. It is easy to treat him as a character rather than a man. But the laughter, if you let yourself settle into this story, goes sideways somewhere. Because what he was doing underneath all of it was something serious. He was insisting on himself in the middle of a war that was trying very hard to reduce human beings to functions. Soldiers are trained to suppress the individual self in service of the unit, and this is necessary and correct. But Jack Churchill managed to maintain that individual self so completely, so stubbornly, that it became the unit's greatest asset. He said once, and this has been quoted often enough that it may have smoothed in the retelling, but it has the ring of authenticity. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. What he meant was something more than the sword. He meant, be who you are. All the way to the shore. All the way up the hill. All the way to the end. The men who served with him, who are the most reliable witnesses we have, said uniformly that they would follow him anywhere. Not despite the bagpipes and the sword and the bow. Because of them. Because a man who is that entirely, completely himself in the face of everything the world is throwing at him is a man who has found the thing worth following. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow the Untold Front. New stories every week.